contained within it. I think that even the Conservatives know better than to try to vote against this one. So what do? They absolutely put every delay tactic possible in place to prevent the bill from actually moving forward and getting supports to Canadians. This way, they can say, no, we were supportive of it the whole time, even though they absolutely allowed no efforts to let it actually get through the process. And so once again, we're now in a position where we've had to program this. You want to interrupt me for a question period?
The honourable member will have 2 minutes, 2 minutes and a half to finish his speech after oral questions. Statements by members. Déclaration de député. L'honorable.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Louis.
Madam Speaker, President Zelensky gets it. The Prime Minister gets it. The countries of the European Union get it. Milton Friedman got it. A price on carbon is not just good environmental policy that will be responsible for up to 1/3 of Canada's emission reductions by 2030. It's also good trading policy. It's also good trade policy, especially for a trading nation like Canada. All member states of the European Union are part of the EU emissions trading system. Ukraine prices carbon too because it wants to integrate the EU market. The EU is implementing its carbon border adjustment tariff, which will penalize goods from countries that don't price carbon. Why does the leader of the opposition want to shut Canadian companies out of the European market? Where's the common sense in that? Why doesn't the leader of the opposition get it? Canadians get it, Madam Speaker. They get that he's just not worth the risk.
Andrew.
Christmas is a time to give and share. And in my home communities, many volunteer organizations work tirelessly to make the season brighter for those in need. From the Cochrane Event Society to the Airdrie Food Bank, volunteers have been doing amazing work throughout the year, and especially during this Christmas season. The Cochrane Active Vets support families by ensuring that they have food and other essential items. The Helping Hands Society and Cochrane assist those who are struggling with housing and basic needs. The Airdrie First Club and Volunteer Airdrie work hard to ensure that families have access to necessities. Meanwhile, Meals on Wheels has been delivering meals to seniors who are unable to leave their homes. And the Banff and Bow Valley Food Banks have been providing support to all who need it. And Volunteer Canmore and Volunteer Banff help to support their communities as well. As we approach the holidays, I want to thank all of these organizations and the countless other individuals who dedicate themselves to helping others. You make a real difference in so many lives. Thank you from your grateful communities for all that you do. Merry Christmas.
The honourable member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Westmount.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. L'environnement est un...
The environment is a subject that is important for all Canadians, and we have a responsibility to our next generations.
An ambitious and affordable plan to combat the effects of climate change. Mr. Speaker, did you know that a recent analysis from the ECCC shows that pollution pricing contributes close to 1/3 of the expected emissions reductions the country will achieve by 2030? And did you know that under the previous Conservative government, Canada was going to blow past our emissions targets, on track to add another 12% of emissions by 2030? We have been working hard to correct the path we're on, with over 100 new measures that are bending the curve on emissions. Already, we are 85% of the way towards our 2030 emissions reduction goals, and we have the best record in the G7 over the last 2 years. Nous ne laisserons pas les conservateurs.
We will not let Conservatives take us back to the Stone Age in terms of climate action.
Bravo.
The honourable member for Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, whether it's field crops, dairy, beef or vegetable production, our honey, our wide variety of apples and, of course, you guessed it, our famous maple syrup that makes us the maple capital of the world, agriculture is part of the DNA of my riding. In fact, since 2021, a citizens' committee set up by the municipality of Saint-Joseph-du-Lac has been working on implementing an eco-responsible system aimed at achieving food self-sufficiency. Well, Mr. Speaker, on the 19th of October, the municipality officially launched its action plan, making it a special food community. I quote, "It will be possible to have access to quality produce throughout the year, and this by reducing the cost of the grocery basket. This development will lead to the creation of a network of sharing and mutual aid between locals, local farmers, and local organizations." Mr. Speaker, we can never do enough to promote our agricultural territory. I therefore invite this chamber to join me in congratulating and thanking all those involved in this inspiring project. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Vimy. Mr. Speaker, our government has cut poverty in Canada almost in half. This has been made possible thanks to measures such as the increase in childcare places, the introduction of the Canada Childcare Allowance, and improved access to dental care. These initiatives have lifted thousands of families out of poverty. It is also important to note that investment in childcare has a positive impact on our economy. This, especially in times of labour shortages, it helps women in particular to re-enter the workforce more rapidly. We remain determined to work to ensure that Quebecers and Canadians do not go back to the Stone Age. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
There's no core identity, no mainstream in Canada. That's what the Prime Minister said in 2015. And after 8 years, we see what that ideology has brought. Canada's becoming a place where neighbours threaten violence over conflicts wrought abroad, as this government for years encouraged them to sort themselves based on what divides rather than what unites. This must end. Canada does have a national identity. We are a people united in the freedom to worship freely, to speak freely, and to prosper freely, knowing that any differences that we may have must be set aside to protect that identity which so many fought and died for. So as we head into the holiday season, a time when Canadians need hope, I ask the Prime Minister to reject the dangerous notion that we don't have a shared identity, to stop dividing Canadians for political gain.
Well,
we must fight to save Canada's peaceful, pluralistic, and prosperous national identity, no matter the cost. Because if he keeps Canada on the path we're currently on, the cost will be much higher still, lest we forget.
The honourable member for Pierrefonds-Dollard.
Mr. Speaker, last week, the leader of the Conservative Party in this chamber said that what happened on the Rainbow Bridge was a terror attack. He was hasty, he was wrong, he misled Canadians, he misled this House when saying that. And again, the Conservative Party is seeking to heckle me as they did my colleague from Brampton Centre. He had to repeat his statement in this House 5 or 6 times. When the leader of the Conservative Party said that, as my colleague from Brampton Centre said, it evoked memories of the Harper government. I personally thought that the Conservative Party was well beyond those sentiments and ideas of maligning minority communities. What happened was wrong. We cannot return to the Stone Age. We cannot return to the Harper government's policies and rhetoric. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Knowing that within 10 years, 1 in 2 Canadians will be of retirement age, we need the entire active population in the labour market, including women. As Quebec has been demonstrating for a number of years, access to educational childcare services at reduced rates is a major incentive for young parents to return to the labour market as soon as they are ready and with peace of mind. That is the reason for which our government is committed to building a pan-Canadian early learning and childcare system. These $10 a day childcare services provide parents with a high-quality, flexible, inclusive and affordable service. Children can develop their social and cognitive skills, which will help them do better at school later on. This is a winning investment for our children, but also for our economic growth. Will the Conservatives cut funding for childcare in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada? Mr. Speaker, we will not be going back to the Stone Age.
The honourable member for Foothills.
They say good men speak more with action than words. Don Tanis was that type of man. A beloved husband, father, and grandfather, Don's distinguished life was one of leadership in his family and his community. An educator and Rotarian for over 7 decades, Don mentored countless community leaders and builders, leaving a priceless legacy in High River. Don, his silent and quiet leadership served him well. Over 14 years as an MLA for Highwood, Deputy Speaker, and he helped build the Alberta Advantage. He was so proud to represent an agricultural riding, and we shared a passion for bison and Alberta's ranching history. Determined to preserve our endangered Alberta grasslands, he worked hard to protect rough fescue as Alberta's official grass, ensuring the preservation of our rangeland for generations to come. His love of politics never waned. He was always the first to pick up a campaign sign and share some sage advice, moments I will cherish forever. Condolences to Christine, Scott, Bruce, and their family. His loss will never be forgotten.
The Honourable Member for Argenteuil-la-Petite-Nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to highlight our firm commitment to Canada's middle class. The government is investing in policies that support families, including through affordable childcare and child allowances. We understand that the well-being of the middle class is the very pillar of our prosperous economy. At the same time, we are strengthening pension plans to ensure the financial security of seniors and investing in clean energy for a green and prosperous future. For Argenteuil-la-Petite-Nation, our government will continue to move forward and progress, investing in human capital, fostering equal opportunities and promoting a modern economy. We are not going back to the Stone Age, Mr. Speaker. On the contrary, we're resolutely moving towards a prosperous and equitable future for all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for North Okanagan-Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, when you tax the farmer that grows the food, it only makes common sense that the food becomes more expensive for the people who buy the food for their tables. And yet, after 8 years, this Prime Minister is still bent on his ideology to shame people for buying what they need: food. Food produced under the increasing cost of the carbon tax, and now the Prime Minister wants to quadruple that tax. Richard's Farm already pays thousands of dollars in carbon tax to grow healthy food for Canadians and will have no choice with the increasing quadrupled carbon tax but to pass it on to consumers trying to feed their families. More tax on growing means even more tax on eating. Common sense, common math. Will the Prime Minister take his carbon tax off of Richard's food production and all farmers, families, First Nations? Finally.
I thought you were going to say in show. The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the so-called Workers' Party, the NDP, made it official that they've turned their back on Canadian workers. The NDP Liberal government is spending $40 billion on vehicle battery plants that amount to a subsidy of $5 million per employee. Ka-ching! Newsbreak, up to half the workers are coming from offshore, so taxpayers will be subsidizing foreign replacement workers. The battery building strategy has always been a boondoggle to transfer Canadian taxpayer dollars to the shareholders of foreign multinationals. It's an economic race to the bottom that this government wants to win. On Friday, I asked the Minister of Check Signing to release the contracts. He told this House that he negotiated this fiasco, but he said the opposite when asked the same question at committee. This evasion and doublespeak is the opposite of transparency. After 8 years, it is obvious that this government is not worth the cost. While common sense Conservatives are demanding that the contracts be released, the NDP are now on board to help the Liberals cover this up.
Well done.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-l'École. Mr. Speaker, we are sadly witnessing an upsurge in misogynistic comments here in Canada. A recent report by Léa Carrier in La Presse Plus highlighted this phenomenon among Canadian teenagers, and it's very worrying. We are fighting to counter this phenomenon and to ensure that women of all ages continue to live in an open, inclusive, and egalitarian society. In the Liberal Party, women have their place and make their voices heard. The Liberal Party holds the record for the number of women MPs and has a cabinet with equal numbers of men and women. We can see the difference in the measures and laws that are tabled and adopted. On the other side of the House, the Conservatives has the weakest women representation, with only 18% of female MPs. In Canada, we are out of the Stone Age, and we don't want to go back to the Stone Age. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Saanich-Sooke.
Hate and violence against 2S LGBTQI plus Canadians, and especially against trans and gender diverse people, is clearly on the rise, including a recent spate of hate crimes in my own constituency. What we need now is action from the federal government to help communities build the resilience they need to fight back. Yes. In an e-petition, more than 5,000 Canadians have already called on the government to implement the recommendations from the white paper on the status of trans and gender-diverse people. As well, unions are calling for amending the Employment Equity Act to include 2S LGBTQI plus Canadians for the first time. This would help trans and gender-diverse Canadians who are among the most economically marginalized get access to employment in the public service and federally regulated industries. Yes, we need leaders at all levels to speak out against hate and violence. But even more, we need to empower 2S LGBTQI organizations so that we can all take our place as full and equal citizens.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, for the 5th time in history, Distillery Beamer in Roberval in my riding has distinguished itself in an international competition. Its gin got a gold medal, and they were deemed Gin Masters in 2023 in the London Dry Gin category. It is made by local products. It has a unique taste. This gin is named after Horace Beamer, who built the 135 last miles of railway line between Roberval and the city of Quebec. Philippe and Alain, since 2017, have made of this microbrewery an absolute success. I would also like, Mr. Speaker, to commend my friend who associated with this microbrewery. To Beamer, congratulations, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mission, Masque, Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party understands a home is the center of everything you do in your life. A home is the place you're secure. A home is where you raise your family. And everyone but this Liberal NDP coalition understands that this dream is being ripped from hundreds of thousands of Canadians.
Exactly.
When the government stands in the way of you getting a home, it stands in the way of your entire life going forward. That is why Conservatives have a plan to build more homes. We will, 1, require big cities to complete 15% more home building per year as a condition of getting federal infrastructure money. 2, we're going to give building bonuses to cities that exceed that target. 3, we're going to require every federally funded transit station be permitted for high-density apartments around it. And 4, we're going to sell off 15% of federal buildings and thousands of acres of surplus federal land suitable for new homes. Housing costs were not like this before the Liberals were elected. Housing costs won't be like this after they're defeated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Alfred Pellan. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to building a green Canada. Security, prosperity and health go hand in hand with a safe environment. Every Canadian deserves clean air, clean water and protection from extreme weather events. This is our golden opportunity to develop a thriving, sustainable, clean economy for ourselves, our children and grandchildren. The leader of the opposition and his party are still stuck in a Harper-era mentality where exports of carbon fuels are considered as the way to prosperity, rather than a potential albatross in a world that is decarbonizing very rapidly. Let's put this rhetoric aside. We must not regress and allow industrial polluters risk the future and the security of our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Housing hell. How are we going to get out of it? That will be the title of my Common Sense documentary. In fact, it is, and more than 4 million people have watched it on the X platform. It shows that the cost of housing has doubled. Canada has one of the worst markets in the world, with much more expensive homes than in the US. People are living in tents. Will the Prime Minister become the 40 million and first person to watch the documentary to understand how to put an end to this housing hell and help people find housing. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Conservative leader is asking the government to withdraw from the housing sector. But we will not repeat the mistakes that he made when he was housing minister under the Harper government. The Conservative plan would not enable enough houses to be built quickly, and it would create more useless red tape. The plan would also stop funding housing projects and would further tax affordable housing. The Conservative leader is focusing on his online popularity, but meanwhile, we will be making sure that everyone has a roof over their heads.
But, Mr. Speaker, people do not have roofs over their head. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, housing costs have doubled. Toronto's the worst housing bubble in the world, and Canada has the worst mortgage bubble in the entire OECD after 8 years of his policies. That's why nearly 4 million people on X alone have watched my groundbreaking and much acclaimed documentary, Housing Hell, How We Got Here and How We Will Get Out. Will the Prime Minister become the 4 millionth Canadian to watch this documentary so he can see a common sense plan to reverse the housing hell that he's caused?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, Canadians need our bold action to keep moving forward on the problem of housing affordability. Unlike the Conservative leader, we know that the federal government plays an essential role in leadership in housing. On this side, we're making historic investments in housing, we're linking public transit dollars to housing density, and we're working with cities to modernize and accelerate the way we build homes. While the Conservative leader focuses on clickbaits and views, we're focused on building homes for Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's funny, he released a video the very same day of him in a starter home pretending that he was a real estate agent, but in reality everyone laughed because they know that he's doubled the housing cost. Right. He's delivered an economy where we have the fewest homes per capita of any country in the G7, even though we have the most land to build on. And Toronto is now the worst housing bubble in the world after 8 years of this Prime Minister. So that's why I'm putting partisanship aside and offering the Prime Minister and the Liberal caucus a private screening of my documentary. Will the Prime Minister put his ego aside and join with me personally to take in this documentary, Housing Hell, How We Got In and How We'll Get Out of it?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The reality, Mr. Speaker, is the Conservative leader continues to call for the federal government to get out of the business of housing. Right. And we will not repeat the same mistakes he made when he was housing minister under Stephen Harper. Right. The Conservative leader's present plan won't build enough homes fast enough, doesn't reach enough cities, and creates unnecessary red tape. He'd also defund affordable housing projects and tax affordable rental construction even more. While the Conservative leader focuses on clickbait and views, we're going to focus on building Canadians more homes.
That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, he did try to make a video. It was a total failure. His videos don't get clicks and his houses don't have bricks. Yeah. After 8 years, that's why housing costs have doubled. He shouldn't have to read his entire answer. I'm offering to inform him. If he would just take 15 minutes away from his photo ops, he can watch my brilliant documentary on X or YouTube with a common sense plan to require cities permit 15% more homes, give them bonuses if they exceed the target, require transit around every new federally funded, require housing around every federally funded transit station, and sell off 6,000 buildings. This is common sense. Let's bring it home.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader's plan is to pick fights with municipalities, to create more red tape, and to withdraw funding for affordable housing and affordable apartments. That's not a plan to build more housing, but he has demonstrated that he's extremely satisfied with his ability to spread misinformation and disinformation online, which, yes, I will admit, he's very good at. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we're focused on delivering solutions for Canadians. We're focused on building more housing housing for Canadians, not focused on self-aggrandizement like the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he is the king of self-aggrandizement, as evidenced by the fact that he's attacking my much-acclaimed documentary when he claims he hasn't even watched it. How would he know about the common sense solutions if he hasn't had the attention span to sit there for 15 minutes on YouTube or X and watch it, Mr. Speaker? We'll even try to get it on TikTok so that he can find it. Mr. Speaker, it includes a common sense plan to cut bureaucracy and taxes so that we can bring it home.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when I came into question period today, I didn't think it'd be I'd be hearing an infomercial for how great Pierre Poilievre's social media skills. Sorry, the leader.
We'll back up. I mean, the Honourable Prime Minister knows he's not supposed to use the names of members of Parliament. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. I didn't think Canadians were going to be hearing an infomercial for the Leader of the Opposition's YouTube page. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is Canadians deserve a government focused on delivering housing for them. That is exactly what we are doing with historic deals with cities right across the country, with measures to build more housing quickly. We are concretely solving that while he's talking to himself online.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, as we continue to listen to this review of amateur film, well, meanwhile, the media is in crisis. Our journalism is getting weaker. Arts and culture, too. Our rural regions, French, they're all under pressure. Will the Prime Minister recognize that there is no worse time to cut 800 positions at Radio-Canada CBC? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've been very concerned for years about what's happening in our media, arts and culture. That's why our government has taken concrete measures to support media throughout the country, to invest in local journalism, to defend journalists and their essential work to our democracy, to defend them from, for example, the web giants. We are very pleased to say that we have an agreement with Google under C-18. We will keep being there to support journalists throughout the country, especially local journalists who play a key role in our democracy. The Honourable Member will very clearly, Mr. Speaker, that is just not enough. The government is getting $100 million from Google. We'd really like to see that agreement, actually, but that is good news. Private media, however, had already cut more than $100 million in their operations. Not only does the Radio-Canada CBC want to get money out of that fund, but it also wants to cut French language and regional local services. And it also wants to give itself bonuses. Will the Prime Minister recognize that CBC needs to be held accountable to the government? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we will always support CBC, Radio-Canada, and its services to local communities throughout the country. One of the first measures we took as a government was to cancel the Harper government's cuts to our public broadcaster. We supported local journalism and media, and that's very important during this difficult time. That's why we brought in Bill C-18. At a time when, unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition is not doing anything about this issue, we will continue to support local media and journalists in Canada.
East. These out-of-touch Liberals have let the housing crisis get so bad that in Halifax this winter, a man died alone in a tent. The average rent in Halifax is now over $2,000 a month. Leaving it up to big developers won't bring down rents. People are being rental evicted. We need real action, not just words. The Liberals are running around announcing and re-announcing existing funding that will not deliver homes for another 4 to 7 years. Will the Prime Minister Minister take immediate action to secure existing empty buildings to get people off the streets this winter.
Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to reach out and work with communities, with municipalities and with provinces right across the country to deliver. We've been announcing projects completed that we started years ago. We're announcing projects that are starting today that will be completed in the coming years. We understand the efforts involved in solving this housing crisis. It requires us all to roll up our sleeves, which is why we put forward $4 billion in a housing accelerator to make sure that municipalities could build more homes. We're putting forward $15 billion to accelerate the construction of rental units. We're going to continue to be there for low-income and homeless people as well.
The Honourable Member for Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Mr. Speaker, food prices aren't going down. A record number of Canadians are turning to food banks for their meals. Before the doors open at Bridges to Hope Food Bank in St. John's, there's already a lineup waiting to collect food hampers. Meanwhile, big grocers like Sobeys, who was here yesterday, are seeing heaps of excess profit, all while offering a nickel to its employees. The Liberals are failing to lower food prices. When are they going to crack down on the corporate greed that is driving Canadians to food banks?
Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, more competition means lower prices, more choice, and more innovative products and services for Canadians. Our affordability legislation will empower the Competition Bureau to hold grocers accountable and prioritize consumers' interests. The Fall Economic Statement proposes further amendments to the Competition Act to crack down on predatory pricing, to better respond to anti-competitive mergers, and more. We are ensuring that Canadians have more competitive options, and we're limiting excess profits by corporations at the expense of Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, we just heard shocking testimony at the Human Resources Committee from the CEO of the Central Okanagan Food Bank. He says projections are another 100% increase in food bank demand in the next 3 to 4 months due to inflation. He expressed how donors and volunteers are now clients. Liberal inflationary spending and carbon tax are adding to the cost of food. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister take the tax off of farmers, families, and First Nations? Finally.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of Families.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest in strengthening social security programs like Old Age Security, Canada Pension Plan, and support for families like the Canada Child Benefit and $10 a day national childcare. Programs which the Conservatives continue to vote against, totally lacking empathy and understanding for the struggle that Canadian families are facing. On this side of the House, we'll continue to do the hard work to ensure that we're there to support Canadian families.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that answer won't satisfy all the Canadians lining up in a food bank for the first time in their lives, or the food banks that are losing donors and volunteers due to Liberal inflation. We heard from not-for-profits how they see the rising price of gas as a barrier to volunteering, and how senior volunteers are being forced back to work to afford basic necessities due to inflation. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister take the carbon tax off of farmers, families, and First Nations? Finally.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important that we focus on affordability for families, and it's also important that we look at facts when it comes to the carbon price that we've put in place. It's also important to remind Conservative members that they ran on a carbon price, and carbon pricing is the most efficient and the cheapest way to lower our emissions, Mr. Speaker. But with respect to food prices, particularly those facing lower income families, Mr. Speaker, today an article lists here that 94% of households with incomes below $50,000 receive far more rebates, exceeding their carbon tax costs in 2023. Mr. Speaker, lower income folks are enjoying more rebates than carbon costs because our carbon pricing.
The Honourable Member for Haldeman Norfolk.
After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government has made life unaffordable for Canadians in every province and territory. Canadians are suffering under this Prime Minister's oppressive carbon tax. And while he taxes, he also divides, pausing the carbon tax on home heating oil in Atlantic Canada because he wanted votes, while he quadruples the tax on every other Canadian. When will this Prime Minister finally cancel the carbon tax on families, farmers, and First Nations?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll focus my response on an economist's response to the rhetoric in this House with respect to the carbon price. He said if we got rid of the carbon tax and the rebate, then this would harm a much larger fraction of lower and middle income households than it would higher income households, Mr. Speaker. Very clearly, the economist from Calgary indicates that our carbon price sends more money back to 94% of families who earn less than $50,000, Mr. Speaker. It's an affordability measure and it fights climate change.
The Honourable Member for Halden Norfolk.
At a time when this country is working towards reconciliation, the Liberals have saddled First Nations community with a punishing carbon tax. First Nations are so burdened by this unfair tax that they have decided to take the government to court. Wow. Canadians everywhere know that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. So, when will this Prime Minister finally remove the carbon tax from farmers, First Nations, and families?
Yeah, when? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll note that our carbon pricing mechanism sends more money back to lower income families than it does. That includes both the fiscal amount and the economic impact. And something the Conservatives love not to focus on is the impact of climate change, Mr. Speaker. Climate change impacts the price of food more than any other factor, Mr. Speaker. And we're also helping farmers because farmers are the ones that know climate change is real because it impacts them first, and that's what's driving up the cost of food, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, food banks can barely keep up. In my region, in Loretteville, there's the Accueil Saint-Ambroise organization, which helps 50 to 60 additional families per month. Meanwhile, what's happening here in Ottawa? This Liberal government wants to impose a new additional carbon tax, and the Bloc Québécois wants to radically increase the tax. When will the Liberal Bloc finally understand that it's time to give a break to these struggling families? The Honourable Minister of Families. Mr. Speaker, we know that many families are struggling to buy groceries. We are here to support Canadians through targeted social programs and income supplements like the Canada Child Benefit, as well as the grocery benefit. We are also offering more support to charitable organizations and food banks. We are continuing to work hard to fight food insecurity. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to very sincerely thank the Minister for her efforts to speak French. But the fact that she's speaking French doesn't actually help with the content of what she's saying. In fact, it shows very clearly that this government is not worth the cost. Let me come back to what's going on in my riding. Again, Accueil Saint-Ambroise last year prepared 176 Christmas baskets, and this year already 238. Meanwhile, the Liberals are inventing a new tax, and the Bloc wants to increase it radically. My question is simple. Why create a new tax when people are struggling? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, this was an important moment. My colleague congratulated my other colleague for speaking French. I guess that's a bit of an attitude change among the Conservatives, but we should go further. We should congratulate We should congratulate my colleague for rising and speaking French despite the tyranny of his colleagues who might not want him to speak French. We will always support his right to speak French in this House. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, do you know how many times this government has met the fossil fuel lobby over the last 2 years? 2,000 times. 2,000 meetings with oil and gas companies over 2 years alone. That's 3 meetings a day, 7 days a week, no holidays. If each of those meetings lasted 20 minutes, Mr. Speaker, that would be the equivalent of watching every single Simpsons episode, 35 seasons, and then do the same thing twice more. So if we're asking ourselves why this government doesn't get more done, well, it's very simple. They're too busy meeting up with their oil and gas sector buddies. What are they really talking about? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a slightly odd question. We meet with stakeholders in all parts of the economy. It's very important for the government to hold conversations to ensure that we are listening to all perspectives in order to be able to produce good public policy. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and the fossil fuel lobby is basically a beautiful love story. 2,000 times they've met up. I mean, at this point, they should just move in together, I think. I have a friendly piece of advice for my colleagues on the Liberal backbenches who feel that that cabinet doesn't listen to them enough. Resign and then become an oil lobbyist. Is that why the Environment Minister invited Suncor, Imperial Oil, Meg Energy, and Cenovus to COP28? Is it that he can't stand a single day without seeing the oil companies? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, we have created a plan to fight climate change. It is the strongest and most detailed in the entire world. And that's something we're very proud of. We have a plan. We believe in fighting climate change. And we are taking appropriate action every day in order to help our children and grandchildren have a better future. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, 2,000 meetings with the fossil fuel lobby over 2 years. That's why Canada hasn't yet announced its plan to cap the fossil fuel sector emissions, because the oil companies are still drafting the plan. And in fact, they don't have time because they spend their whole day meeting with the Liberals. Meanwhile, the Global Carbon Project has announced at COP that we are going to leave behind the 1.5-degree warming target within 7 years. So while the Liberals and oil companies continue with their love fests, the planet is burning. Could the Liberals cancel 1 or 2 meetings and take care of the planet? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we implemented regulations to reduce methane emissions by 75%, and we are the first nation in the entire world to have done that. That's something we must do to act against climate change, and that's something we're doing every day.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Mr. Speaker, I want to help the NDP Liberal government understand why, after 8 years, Canadians know that the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Just look at the carbon tax alone. A recent report by APAS shows that Saskatchewan farmers will pay over $40 million in carbon tax just to get their grains to port. A rebate doesn't even come close to covering that cost for our farmers. The solution is simple. Axe the tax. Why won't they just get it done?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Meeting farmers right across the country, the first question they ask me is, why does the Conservative Party of Canada not have a plan for the environment? I tell them we have a plan for the environment. We will work with governments. We will...
I mean, for gosh sakes, he's right here. I can't hear him. So, hold on. Are we ready? The Honourable Minister of Agriculture from the Utah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The question that I get from farmers across the country is why the Conservative Party of Canada does not have a plan for the environment. I tell the farmers right across the country, we do have a plan for the environment. We will work with farmers right across the country, and for an example, in Saskatchewan, we announced $4 million with the Western Grain Research Foundation, just to make sure that the farmers stay on the cutting edge, that they're able to yield larger crops and make more profit. We have and will continue to work with farmers right across this country.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, farmers know that they are the leaders when it comes to environmental stewardship. Now, just imagine, Mr. Speaker, that you are a young producer. You grew up on the family farm, and your goal is to take over after your parents retire. You start looking over the bills and the costs associated with farming, and one of the highest line items is the carbon tax imposed by this Prime Minister. Rather than hiring a helping hand or upgrading your machinery, you're paying an increasing carbon tax. So, why won't the Prime Minister let his senators pass Bills C2, 3, 4, and axe the tax for on-farm fuels?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I would agree with my honourable colleague. Yes, the farmers are on the front line of the environment. They know that winds of over 200 kilometers an hour, destroying burns, destroying crops, and floods right across the country, and fires right across the country. They want a government that will deal with the environment and make sure that we work with governments, with agricultural clusters to make sure they're able to meet the demands. We will work and continue to work with the agricultural sector, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Ballyfer's Lloydminster.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, 2 million Canadians are relying on food banks to feed their families. The Prime Minister's punishing carbon tax is directly fueling the affordability crisis in this country, and still the Prime Minister plans to quadruple it. The Prime Minister and his failed policies are simply not worth the cost. It's time to axe the carbon tax before it bankrupts all Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister finally take the carbon tax off for our farmers, our families, and our First Nations?
The Honourable Minister of Family, Children and Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, in addition to the support that I continue to share in this House that we do for families, we've also introduced programs to support organizations that are working with Canadians to help address food insecurity, including over 300 organizations, Mr. Speaker, through the Community Services Recovery Fund. We've also invested almost $150 million to strengthen food systems and improve food security, including over 100 community projects. While the Conservatives continue to impose these investments, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to work on behalf of Canadians.
The honourable member for Huron-Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, the Ag Minister, and the Environment are simply not listening to farmers. A pork farmer with a pork farm just down the road where I grew up, his natural gas bill in February was $4,300 just for natural gas. His carbon tax, $3,300, 75%. How can any farmer make a living when you got to pay that much carbon tax on the natural gas you use on your farm? When will the Prime Minister take the tax off farmers, families, and make it fair for farmers? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate my honourable colleague's concern, but the fact of the matter is farmers are concerned about the environment. Farmers are on the front lines. Farmers understand that you have to take care of the environment. When you have winds of over 200 kilometers an hour destroying all the infrastructure on a property, that adds no doubt to the farmer's cost. It adds to the price of food. It adds to everything. That's why it's so important that our government has an environmental plan to make sure that our agricultural sector will continue to thrive.
The honourable member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, not only is the Minister of the Environment going to COP28 with a record number of oil lobbyists, it seems to be a pathological habit. When it comes to the seat of power, the PM Finance's office, Guess who the Liberals meet with and listen to the most? Bingo, the oil and gas companies. According to a TVA compilation, the Liberals open their doors 3 times more often to the fossil fuel industry than to environmentalists. 3 times more. If the Liberals are missing their greenhouse gas reduction targets, could it be because they're puppets of big polluters? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, as I already said, we meet with participants from all industries. Obviously, that includes oil, but it also includes auto and many other industries. As I've already said, we announced something that is a first in the entire world. Yesterday, we announced that we are going to put in place regulations to reduce methane emissions by 75%. We're the first country in the world to have done that. That's leadership for you on climate change.
Victoria.
Canadians are experiencing the horrific impacts of the climate crisis, while Liberals delay, disappoint, and fail to protect our planet. Young people are not only worried about their future, they want to be part of the solution. Hundreds of them just delivered mock cover letters applying for a youth climate corps, and 2 out of 3 young people would consider enrolling in this program to respond to disasters, to create climate resilient infrastructure, and to reduce emissions. Today, I tabled a motion to create a youth climate corps like President Biden did. Will the Prime Minister listen to our future leaders and establish a youth climate corps?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd just like to take a moment to welcome my friend and colleague back to the House. It's good to have her back, not only because it's good to talk about how we fight climate change and not whether we fight climate change in this House. Mr. Speaker, I think the idea with respect to a youth environment corps to fight climate change and bring forward great ideas is an awesome one, and I'm looking forward to talking with the member. And it also gives me great pleasure to announce in this House that Canada is the first country ever to commit to an oil and gas methane emissions target reduction. 75%, Mr. Speaker. Other countries will follow in our footsteps, and we'll bring down our methane emissions by 75% by 2030. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Laval-les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, we Quebecers and Canadians are proud of our culture, our French language, and our commitment to protecting the environment for future generations. In the face of conservative policies that would set us back to the Stone Age, could we know from the Quebec Lieutenant, the Minister of Transport, what initiatives the government is taking to safeguard and enhance our commitments to the environment, language, and culture? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate my colleague on his excellent work. Quebecers are proud to take part in the energy transition, and our government is proud to support it. The Conservatives think it's all a waste of time, but we will continue to support our language and our culture and build these things up, whereas the Conservatives would tear it all down. The Conservatives aren't even letting their colleagues work in French, but we are making French a priority for Quebecers. And the Conservatives would take us back to the Stone Age.
Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
After 8 years, workers know they cannot rely on the NDP. The NDP leader initially called for the release of EV contracts, but last night the NDP flip-flopped and voted with the Liberals to bury them. These contracts will cost taxpayers over $40 billion. That's about $3,000 per Canadian family, and the money will be used to fund foreign replacement workers instead of Canadian paychecks. The NDP Liberal government betrayed workers and are complicit in cover-up. So what did the Liberals offer the NDP to get them to change their position and abandon workers and taxpayers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Investments like the LG Stellantis EV battery plant represent a win for the economy, a win for Canadian workers, and a win for the fight against climate change. But the Conservatives are so committed to their doomsday narrative that they just can't admit that anything good is happening. In a recent article in the Globe and Mail, a journalist writes about the Conservative leader. He has not said he opposes subsidizing these battery makers. Rather, he is seeking to rile up working-class voters by falsely suggesting foreigners might be stealing their jobs. While the Conservatives are blinded by their self-induced rage, we're focused on realizing a positive vision for the future of our economy.
Just say there's a lot of chatter in the chamber. I just hope they bring it down just a little bit. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, I have a simple proposition for the member. If the NDP Liberal government is genuinely proud of their work, then release the contracts. Let all of us see them so that we can know. But the NDP is complicit with the Liberals in trying to bury these contracts. Why? Every Canadian family will pay $3,000 for these deals. So they want to know what is in these deals for them. Again, what did the Liberals offer the NDP to get them to change their position, abandon workers, and hide these contracts? What are they hiding?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to share positive news. Canada is number 3 in the world in foreign direct investment, which is something that we should all be proud of, Mr. Speaker. Brendan Sweeney from the Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturers said, and I quote, about specialized expertise workers needed from outside of Canada to help set up the giant facility. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Windsorites going off to the U.S. to help set up, test, and service machinery in plants. It's a little hypocritical to fail to take into account the way foreign direct investment works.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
To help pay for overseas replacement workers, the NDP Liberal government is going to send every Canadian family a bill for $3,000. The formerly pro-worker NDP have refused to stand up to the Prime Minister and demand the release of contracts that detail the number of foreign replacement workers that are going to take Canadian jobs. This Prime Minister clearly isn't worth the cost to Canadian workers after 8 years, and neither are the NDP. So will the Prime Minister finally stand up and tell Canadians how many foreign replacement workers $40 billion buys?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's curious after 8 years in opposition to listen from these Conservatives and how little they have learned on foreign direct investment, Mr. Speaker. Clearly nothing. How little they understand about free trade deals, Mr. Speaker. Clearly nothing. How little they understand about creating good middle-class jobs, Mr. Speaker. What they are clearly against is 2,500 full-time jobs at the Stellantis plant, 2,300 construction jobs there. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that under a Conservative administration, Canada would be closed for business. Guess what, Mr. Speaker? Not on our watch.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Well, let's talk about what's happened under their watch. The Canadian Building Trade Union says that so far, this NDP Liberal government has cost them $300 million in wages. So if they are so proud of their record and so proud of these great deals that are going to cost every Canadian family $3,000, why won't they just release the contracts? They know that releasing those contracts will expose that $40 billion is buying a lot of foreign replacement workers that should instead be funding Canadian paychecks. Why won't they release the contracts today?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Mr. Speaker, there are smart people on the Conservative benches, including trade lawyers and people who understand that contracts between nations and between countries need to stay confidential because of important trade secrets. Mr. Speaker, what do the Conservatives have against the fact that Canada is now 3rd in the world in foreign direct investment, Mr. Speaker, after the United States, after Brazil? Who is it? Canada, ahead of China, Mr. Speaker. Clearly they're against Dow in Fort Saskatchewan. They're against Stellantis. They're against Bécancour. When are the Conservatives going to be on the side of workers, Mr. Speaker? I don't know. Maybe they do.
I don't know why the chatter went up. Je comprends pas, là.
The honourable member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, not even 2 weeks after the government's economic update, CBC Radio-Canada, a Crown corporation and the public broadcaster, paid for mainly with our tax dollars, is cutting 800 positions and firing 600 people. The media crisis that affected the private sector is clearly spreading to the public sector. This will affect the quality of information, news, TV series, soaps, and our ability to tell stories. How long has the minister known about this? Did she agree with the decision? And if she didn't, what's she going to do to try to prevent the bloodletting? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I share my colleagues' concerns about the future of CBC Radio-Canada and about the future of the media in general. And that's why our government is working. We modernized the legislation to better support broadcasting all across the country. And obviously, when it comes to CBC Radio-Canada, in our 2015 budget, we restored funding that the Conservatives had cut. We also supported them through the pandemic. We will continue to be there to defend the future of CBC. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, Radio-Canada does better than CBC with its news and other programming. Everything works better at Radio-Canada than at CBC. And why is that? We know that there are fewer employees at Radio-Canada, but they're suffering just as many cuts as CBC. We can't imagine that the Heritage Minister was unaware that this was coming. Did she inform the Finance Minister before the update? The Honourable Minister of Heritage. Mr. Speaker, we are obviously concerned about the future of CBC Radio-Canada, and that's why we supported them adequately during the pandemic. And when we took office after the Conservatives, we restored a great deal of funding that they had cut. We respect this Crown Corporation. We respect their independence. We would encourage management to be more transparent about this type of decision, but we will work to ensure the long-term survival of this organization.
Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, in little under a decade, Canada's housing costs have basically doubled. Earlier today, members of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations shared with me a story of 7 individuals living in one apartment. We know that there are many similar stories about this across this country. After 8 years, students are becoming homeless under this NDP Liberal government. This PM is not worth the cost. When will this government step aside so we can get Canada back on track?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for her question, and I thank the members of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations for their advocacy. In fact, I used to be a member when I was in student government at St. FX University. Mr. Speaker, I should say, when we actually compare the policies of the Conservative Party to the policies that the government is putting forward, it is clear that their policies will do more harm than good and raise the cost of living. We are putting policies in place that's going to remove the tax on new apartment construction so we get more apartments built. They are going to put the tax back on. Mr. Speaker, we're investing in affordable housing when they're campaigning on a commitment to make sure they do not invest. When it comes to supporting students and the housing that they need, the solutions lay on our side of the House.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, last Saturday, our leader unveiled a documentary on the housing crisis to explain to Canadians its causes and some proposed solutions. There have been over 4 million views, and for good reason. After 8 years of this Liberal government, housing prices have doubled, rents, mortgages, and homelessness is going through the roof. People are suffering. Will the minister check his ego at the door, watch the Leader of the Opposition's documentary, and adopt the suggested solutions to help Canadians afford housing? The Honourable Minister.
Accept a question talking about checking your ego at the door regarding the opposition leader who uses his space on the floor of the House of Commons to invite people to watch a video. I'm curious how many of those views are actually the opposition leader.
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I'm beginning to question how many of those views are the opposition leader actually going home at night and watching himself on the internet. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to which party has a plan to build more homes, it is clear that it is the government. We have a plan to cut the cost of building. We have a plan to invest in cities. We have a plan to invest in affordable housing. We will get the job done.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the minister may laugh, but what's he going to say to the young man in Sherbrooke who can't afford $1,500 a month for rent, so he's living in a tent it's like a refugee camp right in the middle of Sherbrooke? And that's because of all the things the Liberals have done in the past 8 years. None of them are working. And even with every effort that ordinary people are making, they can't even afford to pay their rent. What's the government going to do about this? Mr. Speaker, I understand this situation. And as a matter of fact, that's why we've invested in affordable housing in Sherbrooke. That's why we're investing like $900 billion with our partners in the province of Quebec. It's important to continue making those investments. It's incredible, Mr. Speaker, that this member and the leader of the opposition opposed investments in affordable housing. It's essential to keep investing.
To build the homes that Canadians need, including in Sherbrooke.
The honourable member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, our businesses here in Canada have been attracting amazing amounts of foreign investment. And in Quebec, we know that 99% of businesses are small and medium-sized businesses. They play a key role in our economic growth. We must avoid retreating into an economic stone age that would favor foreign, polluting multinationals. So I have a question for the Minister of Economic Development for Quebec. How are we supporting entrepreneurs in Quebec? The Honourable Minister of Economic Development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague's right. Our government partners with small business, not just in Quebec, but all around the country. Unlike the Conservatives who'd like to invest more in fossil fuels, we're investing in green energy, like a company in Montreal and in Thetford Mine, in the Gaspé. We're supporting wind power. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue investing in the economy of the future. I'd like to know, what are the Conservatives going to cut back on for entrepreneurs in Quebec?
Grand Lake. Mr. Speaker, under this Prime Minister, New Brunswickers are struggling to pay the rent. After 8 years, he's just not worth the cost. While rents are too high in major cities, recent increases have been the biggest in New Brunswick. According to Stats Canada, rent has inflated nearly 30% just in New Brunswick in the last 4 years alone. Will the Prime Minister agree that now is the time to get the gatekeepers out of the way so more rental housing can be built in the province of New Brunswick?
The Honourable Minister of Housing and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for his question. When it comes to actually getting gatekeepers out of the way and reducing red tape, I point the honourable member that we recently signed an agreement with the City of Moncton so they can change the way they allowed cities to be built in that city. We are going to see thousands of new homes in the city, and now we are working with other cities across New Brunswick and rural communities as well. What's fascinating, Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives were concerned about reducing the cost of rent, they should abandon their plans to put the GST back on rental construction. They should avoid the mistakes of the past by abandoning their commitment to stop investing in affordable housing. We will get...
The Honourable Member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government's incompetence and lack of caring, we have seen a housing hell unleashed on Canadians. They've actively caused housing, mortgages, and housing-related costs to double in the last 8 years. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. We have people living in tent cities and in their cars, Mr. Speaker, and this is when the dream of home ownership is evaporating for younger Canadians. They are putting photo ops ahead of housing. When will this Prime Minister realize that he's built more tent cities than houses?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the enormously difficult situation that families are going through who are having trouble affording the cost of a place to live. But I will not accept criticisms from that member or the Conservative Party of Canada when they stand up to, when the cameras are on, to make hay for a political reason, when they had the opportunity to stand up to vote on whether we should support initiatives that are going to help the homeless population in Canada. They vote against them. Yeah. They are currently campaigning on a promise to get out of the business of housing. We've made that mistake for 30 years. We started this government in 2017 with the National Housing Strategy to invest in affordable housing. We need to invest, not make cuts, as that member wants to.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister has created housing hell. Mortgage payments have more than doubled, and housing prices have also doubled. Makeshift encampments where people sleep in tents are popping up all over Canada. In Sherbrooke, for example, a young man in his 30s has no choice but to live in his tent because he can't find a room anywhere. Will this Prime Minister put an end to his inflationary spending so Quebecers can have a roof over their heads this winter, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister of Housing. Mr. Speaker, it's very important to have a solution to the problem. Currently, we are investing in construction of affordable housing in Sherbrooke. We're investing in partnership with the province of Quebec to build 8,000 new affordable units. It's very important to continue this work. The opposition to these programs from the Conservatives is unfathomable. It's just impossible to keep answering these questions. The Honourable Member for Saint-Léonard Saint-Michel. Mr. Speaker, several countries have agreed to triple their production capacity for renewable energies like solar, wind, and hydroelectric. This commitment contrasts sharply with the Leader of the Opposition's approach, who favors oil production and symbolizes a retreat to the Stone Age in the fight against climate change. Can the Minister inform us of the commitment made by our government at COP28 to advance Canada and its renewable energy production capacities? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. I'd like to thank my colleague for her hard work. This global goal is consistent with our work to provide affordable energy while protecting Quebec's advantage in reliable, clean energy. The new federal clean investment credits will unlock projects and create jobs. While we work hard to build up, on the other side, the Conservatives want to tear down Quebec's clean economy, and the Bloc has nothing to offer but talk.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Mr. Speaker, in British Columbia, 2 people died, and one is still missing at sea because their vessel could not be found. It was discovered that life-saving direction-finding technology has been unavailable. Those on the water deserve to know that help will be there to find them. But instead of investing in the safety of people, the Liberals followed the lead of the Conservatives, slashing funding and closing 10 Coast Guard communication centres. Canadians deserve better. When will the government provide the Coast Guard with the necessary resources to keep mariners safe?
Hear, 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 hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of DFO and the Canadian Coast Guard.
Mr. Speaker, ensuring the health and safety of Canadians at sea is a top priority for our government. The Coast Guard is working around the clock to modernize and replace the radio detection system with a more robust and accurate network. While this work continues, Mr. Speaker, there are a wide variety of other systems in place, including a radar installation and shipboard detection finding system on Coast Guard vessels. But be reassured, Mr. Speaker, and I want Canadians to be reassured that the Coast Guard's mission of safety at sea is unimpeded by this work.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, this summer Canada relied on volunteer firefighters and search and rescue to risk their lives to keep us safe, but the Liberals have been letting them down. 9,500 volunteer firefighters quit in 2023, and the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, who are here today, say that doing the work and paying for the equipment is unaffordable. Well, the Liberals are in luck. The NDP has a bill that would up the volunteer firefighter tax credit to $10,000. So will the government support our volunteer firefighters by voting yes on the NDP's plan to increase the volunteer firefighter tax credit?
The Minister.
For the very important question. In fact, actually, just yesterday I was in West Kelowna visiting the firefighters after the devastating wildfires that took place in West Kelowna and all across British Columbia. We talked about many different measures that the firefighters were going to be supporting. In addition to training of 1,000 firefighters, and we have a lot of options currently on the table. But make no doubt about it, Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting our firefighters. Thank you.
Good. And that's all the time we have for question period today. I've got a recognition to do, and then we'll do some points of order afterward. Wish to draw the attention of the members, the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Richard Muston, Minister of Community Services and Minister responsible for the Workers' Safety Compensation Board of the Yukon. And she's not. All right. The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Point of order on decorum. During member statement, the member from Chateauguay-Lacal called the women of the Conservative Party weak. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life, but weak isn't one of them. The member's language tearing down women and reducing our value to a quota is exactly what discourages women from running for office and makes it harder for every single one of us here. Strength comes from courage of action, no matter someone's gender, not from tokenization. If the member wanted to show some strength of her own, she'd apologize.
I'll just say quickly that we must be judicious in our words. We will go back and listen to it and come back to the House if something needs to be done. I believe the Honourable Government House Leader has something to table. There you go, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. Pursuant to Standing Order 111.1, I have the honour to table in both official languages a certificate of nomination and biographical notes for the proposed appointment of Eric Jantz to the position of Clerk to the House of Commons. That the nomination and biographical notes be referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I don't know, maybe the next step should be to ask him if he really wants to be there. It being 3:16, the House now proceeds to the taking of the deferred recorded division, the motion to concur in the 13th report on the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs. Call in the members. Okay, just being sure before I start reading. Okay, the question is as follows. Monsieur Desilets, appuyez.
Mr. Desilets, seconded by Ms. Chabot, moved that the 13th report of the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs presented on Thursday, November 9th, 2023, be conferred in. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please